Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thomas, DeAngelis. The panel that, are you guys all here in the back? Okay. The name of the panel today is From Past to Present Tense. We'll be talking about some of the things that have been mentioned in the past today and yesterday, and trying to think them forward. So we're joined by, I'm going to introduce everyone as they present. I think that might be a little quicker. So first up is Professor Fritz Calixte, presenting a paper titled American and Haitian Independencies and the Misunderstanding of Freedom. Professor Fritz Calixte will be presenting how the first two independencies in the New World were realized in the name of freedom of the moderns, but cover two almost antithetical meanings of the same word. Haiti, in addition, shares this misunderstanding of freedom with the French Revolution, for this former colony of the Caribbean takes again the concept of freedom developed by the philosophers of the Enlightenment to extend it beyond what was thought in Europe. The extension of the concept beyond the European-centered world will not be without consequences already in the project of modernity and will constitute a true line of fracture between the former slaves of St. Domingue American and French revolutions. I was hoping to be a little bit more about your bio, so if you want to introduce yourself, I should have read this before, but if you want to introduce yourself, the university, your university affiliation, just a little bit about yourself, and then you can go into your presentation. Pass the microphone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, and actually, if because he's fluent in French and his English is like, if you need translation, here I can help. Also, specifically at the time to ask him some specific questions.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Before I want to say thank you and your organizers. Excuse my English, I know I have a very bad English. I will talk to you about the misunderstanding of freedom as an outcome of the American and Haitian revolution. On January 1st, 1804, in Haiti, the last modern revolution occurred. The latest revolution was led by people who were considered as mere property and who wanted to be considered as human beings on the basis highlighted the philosopher of enlightenment. The common point between Haitian revolution and the three preceding revolutions of the modern period is that it is an appropriation of an ideal of freedom, of equality, and of autonomy of reason, passed from the theory of the Enlightenment philosopher to political practice. The latest revolution has not always been accepted as a real modern revolution. Also, it completes the project of universality of reason. This was made clear and a comment made by Regis Debray about the elaboration of human rights ideas for this contemporary philosopher. If this concept took life in Paris, it is in Saint-Domingue that was applied. Until the slave revolution, human rights were understood as the rights of white people. The Haitian revolution was therefore unique. It showed that black skin was not impervious to the notion of freedom. This discrepancy highlights the difference in terms of understanding of what freedom should be. Modern freedom ceases to be a mere European idea to become the wish of every man, starting with Latin American. Thus, it is necessary to analyze this misunderstanding to understand its expression, to elucidate its consequences, and what is its step when it comes to the relationship between the Western world and Haiti. If political modernity is characterized by the desire to limit absolutism and warranted individual freedom, for a large number of historians of philosophy, however, it was the English, American, and French revolutions which played the role of the test bench where work could have been responsive by the school of natural law or by the theorism of contractualism was submitted to the test of practice. These revolutions have finished modern philosophical thought with the material for reflection which would, in some cases, enable it to review or modify the problems it had formulated. However, to distinguish the American and French Revolution, Philippe Renaud sees in the American Revolution a greatness and even a proper poetry which belongs to beauty, while the French Revolution will be, however, comparable to the sublime. This comparison, which places beauty and the realization of the ideal of modernity on the side of the American and the sublime on the side of the French Revolution, reminds us of the difference that Immanuel Kant establishes between the two notions. Indeed, the German philosopher defines beauty as what is universally pleasing with no concept, as what consumes with harmony and happiness with no excess. The sublime, however, does not necessarily attract. On the contrary, it evokes fear or at excess. Kant, speaking of the French Revolution, observed that it provokes a sublime emotion because it aimed to break with the past and intended to create what Hannah Arendt called a whole new social order, in which freedom and equality will be the only values to define a man. Can we really consider the French Revolution to be sublime and the conscience of the world, taking into account the limited anthropological framework to which the concept of freedom and equality apply? Could we not find an ultimate revolution just as modern, which will shift the French Revolution to the side of beauty and take the place of the sublime? The Haitian Revolution of the 1804 seems to correspond to this pattern. Considering the context of colonialism and slavery in the 18th century, it was not only great, it was great beyond on comparison. Men thought to be servile have been able to depart from this representation, establish themselves as free and equal to any other man. It is an act which, in the spirit of the sublime concept, does violence to the imagination that tries to grasp it. In this sense, it forces the admiration and the imagination and the respect of the intelligence we fall to represent it, because it surpasses the imagination. It is in this sense that its realization gives the fundamental concepts of modernity their effective universality. Thus, the Haitian Revolution maintains a two-way relationship with modernity. in the sense with Hegel understands it. What is rational becomes effective, and what is effective becomes rational. Because with Haiti, human rights as rational become effective. Regis Debray does not say the opposite. He noted that the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was thought of in Paris, but carried out in Saint-Domingue, where the rights of the white man became universal almost without their knowledge. The Haitian Revolution also has links with the three other modern revolutions, English, American, and French. And this quartet of modern revolutions carried out in the name of freedom. The Haitian one finds itself in the same geographical orbit as the American. They are the first two successful revolutions of the New World. Between the two, there is more of a philosophical proximity, but also similarities which would be interesting to examine in order to see if they do not feel misunderstanding and the relations that developed between the two states. Two acts of independence, two ideas of freedom, and the opinion of more than one. The American Declaration of Independence is a writing that can be versed in the reflection of the Enlightenment. Its author, Thomas Jefferson, elaborated taking into account the work of Locke, John Locke, and other European philosophers. The originality of this text, which tries to reconcile theory with practice, is that intended to make up for the weakness of the former. Jefferson had proposed the idea of abolishing slavery. However, during the work for the adoption of the final text, this idea was not maintained on the ground that the of the abolition of slavery will make the Constitution of the United States impossible. Thus, the very idea of neighbors at liberty constituted a risk to the very existence of the United States. If it was possible to debate on these remarks of the conventions to decide upstream on the Constitution, it represents a tacit agreement between the actors who are fighting for American independence. Indeed, unlike Saint-Domingue, where the colonies who fought for the autonomy of the colony armed and associate Slavs with their movement. Those of future American Federation will take the precautions of keeping the slaves away from their fight. They accept, however, that aid comes from France and its colonies, among others Saint-Domingue and its Slavs. Its demonstrators are the idea of keeping the Negro situation unchanged. It's inscribed in the foundation of American independence. Most of the Slav fighters who came from Saint-Domingue did not remain in the new state. They entered Saint-Domingue and found themselves involved in the struggle for the emancipation of the Negroes. Conclusion. Words and fans. It's the beautiful formula approved by Michel Foucault, and which is not without antecedent in the 18th century. Even if only in poetry, this formula evokes the question of representation and speaks of the relation between the object and the word to say it. This almost poetic relationship between word and reality does not always apply to all situations. The word freedom, for example, as thought by the moderns, does not refer to a definite reality once and for all. Here we are dealing with a world that is constantly adapting to new experience of freedom. In this sense, the word freedom and equality thematized by the moderns because of discrepancy between theory and practice contains them for misunderstandings. The declaration of the rights of women and the citizen is another misunderstanding of freedom. For women during the period of liberation, so and the proclamation of human rights, applicability to them, claim and the outline to realize a plan of emancipation. The French revolutionaries did not understand the freedom and equality or concept and perpetual redefinitions. They are constantly expanding. It is this difficulty in understanding freedom and equality as concepts and constant expansion. Unfinished, to use the word of Jürgen Habermas. That explains the misunderstanding of freedom between the first three modern revolutions and that of Haiti. This misunderstanding seems to be the fracture in which modernity seems to be oriented in two directions. On that one's along its movement toward progress and thus the universalization of the project, and the other which falls back on itself by asking for the end of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Fritz, for the presentation. Next up is Professor Errol Henderson. The title of the talk is called Giving Substance to Freedom, the Implications of the Slave Revolution in U.S. Civil War to Black Freedom in the Postbellum Era. Professor Henderson, Dr. Errol Anthony Henderson is Associate Professor of Political Science at Pennsylvania State University, where he teaches international relations, U.S. foreign policy, the analysis of war and peace, and African politics. He earned his PhD in political science at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in 1993. He is the author of more than 30 scholarly publications, including 3 books, and he has lectured throughout North America, Europe, and Africa. Can everyone hear me from here or no?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, sort of.
Use the mic.
All right.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for staying. And I just want to say personally, just to thank Liv Yarrow. I mean, Liv's just been, all the folks on the committee, but Liv especially, she's just been doing these little things around here, and you can notice when people are just looking out for you, and I just want to acknowledge that. That's just really wonderful. It has nothing to do with all the food she gave me last night. I just want to acknowledge that. All right, So this piece, I want to share with you the abstract. I want to keep my union cards. I'm going to read some of this. As a political scientist, I mostly summarize some of these points. But I'm going to read some of this. I brought some paper, some copies of the paper, if you're interested in it, that's sitting on the front there. So I said, at the outset of the Black Power movement, Malcolm X called for both a black political and cultural revolution. However, he never developed his thesis on the latter and did not adequately explain the relationship between the two. Instead, like many Black Power movement revolutionists, he privileged cases of revolutions from abroad, which were often ill-fitted to the peculiar history and contemporary challenges of Black America. Interestingly, W.B. Du Bois had historicized the black political revolution that had occurred in the U.S. in his Black Reconstruction in 1935, and Alain Locke had theorized the cultural revolution in the U.S. a decade later. Thus, on the cusp of the Black Power movement, historically grounded and theoretically compelling theses on both black political and cultural revolution in the U.S. were available to Black Power movement revolutionists to inform their struggle. However, these Black American sources were largely ignored. These sources suggested the importance of the slave revolution in the U.S. Civil War. Yes, that occurred. The political revolution that Du Bois historicized and the emancipatory potential of black culture, especially black religion, in generating a cultural revolution that Alain Locke theorized. Although the slave revolution emerged largely from a cultural impetus that wedded political and economic factors in a larger thrust for racial democracy, it left unabated the cultural system of white supremacism. It was a black cultural revolution, but it did not generate an American cultural revolution. And this spoke to the resilience and persistence of white supremacism among white Americans individually and their institutions of power generally, which would make black freedom a caricature of what blacks had fought for and thought they had obtained. Unwilling to pay the cost of freedom in the form of reparations to blacks for slavery and Jim Crow, white supremacism undermined black claims through the maintenance of its racist cultural system throughout the U.S., especially its education, criminal justice, and governance systems. Therefore, while cultural transformation would be a salient factor to future black liberation struggles, and culture would need to be viewed as more than a mechanism to organize struggles for meaningful black freedom internally, but also a focus of the liberation struggle externally. So in this piece, what I did was I examined the salience of Du Bois and Locke's revolutionary thesis to the Black Power movement. But I took as my point of departure Malcolm X's revolutionary thesis. Then I analyzed Du Bois's argument on the slave revolution of the Civil War. And then I explicated Locke's lesser-known arguments on cultural revolution before fusing the two and discussing the relevance of both to contemporary time. So that's the abstract. So I'm not going to get through this, but I want to tell you, it's there if you're interested in the paper, okay? But I want to hit some of the main points. My main issue is this. So often in academia focuses on black activists, revolutionaries as actors, but rarely theorists. David Hilliard of the Black Panther Party said, and I think it's still salient, he said, the leftist radicals appreciated our thuggery and not our theory. And I challenge those. I mean, the piece by, I believe it was Heiner. Is it Heiner who wrote the piece by 2007 on Foucault? Foucault appropriated his thesis on the carceral state when he came to the U.S. and studied with and observed the Black Panther Party and took that from Angela Davis and from George Jackson, from these theses. He hadn't written on that subject the way he did until then, and then without attribution went back there. When we talk about, even in my class, I teach international relations, before Lenin had made his arguments, what appear to be seminal arguments on the precursors to World War I, Du Bois had made these arguments in the Atlantic Monthly, published in 1915, a year before that publication, but rarely is it anthologized, and rarely do you find it in introductory courses in world politics. So my challenge is for, I'm not opposed to cosmopolitan views of theory, but I'm thoroughly convinced that I'm not here today by the good graces of white folks. I'm here because black folks not only struggled for liberation, they theorized and strategized and made a way for us to be here to achieve this condition of freedom that we do have. You see? So I study as black theorists. I'm not opposed to, again, cosmopolitan views. But did they have any theory? Were there any theories in their work? You see? And I think there were. So I posed these and I gleaned from these, and I want to argue further that critical error of the Black Power movement, I ain't mad at them, they were doing a lot of other things. They didn't draw from the theory that was right underneath their feet. And the main one was that there was a slave revolution in this country, and it took place during the US Civil War, and he called it the General Strike. So I'm trying to keep some more of my Union cards, so you got to put that up so I can... Okay, so let me know. But here I go. I'm going to try to read you some of this, all right? I said Malcolm X was undeniably the central revolutionary theorist of the Black Power movement. Malcolm X's thesis on Black revolution in the U.S. was rooted in his Black nationalist ideology. A lot of the difficulty understanding Malcolm's revolutionary theory because they don't understand his Black nationalism. We wrote this piece, this edited volume, By Any Means Necessary, in response to Manning Marble's work. Because Manning doesn't engage Malcolm as a political theorist because he doesn't have a lot of respect for Black nationalism, and he has even less respect for Malcolm's thesis or Malcolm's approach as a theorist, and his main one was on cultural revolution. Let me make that part plain. Malcolm called for both a Black political and cultural revolution in the U.S. While his call for political revolution is widely known and is captured in his most famous speeches and writings, including Message to the Grassroots, The Ballad of the Bullet, The Black Revolution, and the Worldwide Revolution, his arguments on Black cultural revolution are not as widely appreciated, although they were no less central to his main arguments. The latter is evident in the statement of the basic aims and objectives of Malcolm's most important post-Nation of Islam organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, in which Malcolm stated that, quote, we must launch a cultural revolution to unbrainwash an entire people, end quote. He insisted that, quote, culture is an indispensable weapon in the freedom struggle, and that armed with the knowledge of the past, we can with confidence charter a course for our future. Malcolm's calls for political and cultural revolution were consistent with his recognition that the Black liberation struggle in the U.S. was part of a larger worldwide revolution, which consisted of both a political or military revolution against Western imperialism, modeled in the anti-colonial struggles occurring throughout the Third World, and a cultural revolution among Black Americans against white supremacists in the U.S. But there were major shortcomings in Malcolm's analysis, and it's epitomized in the problem of his reverse civilization. Let me make this plain. Civilizationism is a quality that's inherent in ideologies in general, but especially in Black nationalism. Wilson Moses writes about this, his seminal work on his 1978, The Golden Age of Black Nationalism. He argues that Black nationalists are the classical Black nationalists, he would say, up to about 1925, they were territorial separatists, but often cultural assimilationists. That is, they wanted to be separate from whites, but they also had a view of benighted Africans. They wanted to return the Africans to civilize the heathen as well. See? So in this sense, he called this civilizationism. This was, arguably, this is elided from Black nationalism by Du Bois. It's Du Bois who argues that, no, Africans have a culture, contra Hegel, Africans have a culture, and so do African Americans. So after Du Bois, Black nationalism becomes Black cultural nationalism. Before there was a debate whether even a culture exists. Now watch what Malcolm does. Malcolm says, and many Black Power movement revolutionists, they argue that Black folks were stripped of their culture, African Americans, through enslavement and Jim Crow. They were stripped of their culture. So without this culture and this cultural consciousness, and also the revolutionary consciousness he thought was going to derive from it, Blacks were better suited, African Americans were better suited to follow Africans who had already embarked on their liberation struggles. He reversed civilizationism. The civilization of the 19th century said African Americans need to go to Africa to bring civilization to the heathen. Malcolm said, what did he say? He said, you lost your mind in Africa. That's what Malcolm said. Malcolm said African Americans need to follow. And this is only fitting. It was just Malcolm X's birthday yesterday, right? It's also Ho Chi Minh's birthday. But nevertheless, so Malcolm reversed it. But what did he do? In his attempt at a more cosmopolitan orientation that was constantly Black nationalist, Black nationalism can be reconciled with the two. I know it sounds counterintuitive. Yeah. It can be reconciled with the two. Malcolm reversed civilizationism, and what he did was he attempted to import from third world context, in quotes now, third world context to a first world context. And what happened is his followers replicated this error. So what did they miss? They missed the revolution under their feet. What revolution under their feet? What are you talking about? Here we go, let's jump to that. In Black Reconstruction, originally published in 1935, you all familiar with that. Rose, are you familiar with this? I was talking to Rose, and Rose said, she don't deal with this millennium. I gotta remember, I'm in the classics era. Y'all comfortable? Can we go here? I'm gonna stay here for a little bit, but I'm gonna go back to the past. So, Du Bois argued that, okay. Du Bois argued that during the Civil War, enslaved Blacks prosecuted a general strike and furnished about 200,000 troops, as he says, whose evident ability to fight decided the war. The following year, in the Negro and Social Reconstruction, he noted, quote, this is Du Bois. What was really the largest and most successful slave revolt came at the time of the Civil War, when all the slaves of the vicinities all the slaves in the vicinity of the invading armies left the plantations and rushed to the army, and eventually some 200,000 ex-slaves and northern Negroes joined armies of the North, in addition to a much larger number of laborers and servants. It was this revolt of the slaves and the prospects of a much larger movement among the 4 million other slaves, which was the real cause of the sudden cessation of the war, end quote. For Du Bois, the general strike reflected not merely the desire to stop work, but was a strike on a wide basis against the conditions of work. It involved directly in the end perhaps 500,000 people who wanted to stop the economy of the plantation system, and to do that they left the plantation. Look here, this was a slave revolution. The contemporary records discuss slave revolution or slave revolts at the time. Steve Hahn wrote a book, 2004, made these same basic arguments as Du Bois, won a Pulitzer Prize. Steve Hahn also says the slave revolution in the U.S. compares favorably to Saint-Domingue, compares favorably to the Haitian Revolution. There's no illusion about it. Stephanie McCurry makes a similar argument in Confederate Reckoning. It's hidden in plain sight. The slave revolution. Sometimes folks will say, like, why you have a slave revolution with the Union Army? I teach war. Well, I don't teach it, but I teach the analysis of war. Tell me war you know don't involve allies. Haitian Revolution, they have allies. The question is, what's the objective? And it was successful. It overthrew the system of chattel slavery. Don't get it twisted. Okay, they got 9 years, right? 8 years. No, they'll get 12. But I'm thinking of the 13th Amendment, so 1868 to 1877. But don't get that twisted. They overthrew chattel slavery. Because if you just think, yeah, but then what happened next? You won't learn your victories. You won't see what's actually successful. And what was it about the general strike? So I expanded on Du Bois' work in Black Reconstruction. Du Bois didn't relate the causative elements that got us to the general strike because he didn't study the slave revolts. Du Bois wanted to write a biography of Nat Turner. His first publisher rejected that. Then he said Frederick Douglass, his next publisher rejected that, so he settled on John Brown. But if Du Bois had studied that, I think, he was familiar with the slave revolts, but this was key. What motivated the slave revolts? From Charles Delon to Gabriel, Denmark, Nat Turner. There was a religious orientation that provided this ideological glue. That's the time left, right? I'll make it. That provided the ideological glue. But they had a system of hired out slaves, slave artisans, especially blacksmiths. And there was what was going on was a sort of semi-proletarianization of slave labor. Read in Frederick Douglass' slave narrative. When Frederick Douglass, who was a blacksmith, when he talks about working next to the white blacksmiths, he's enslaved, right? He's a slave. He says at the end of the month, he sees the other blacksmiths get the money and his master takes his money. He said he was being robbed. He's a slave. But he said, this is my work. I do just as well. They were getting a sense of their proletarianization even as they were enslaved. And also the untold story, a wonderful scholar named Starobin did excellent work on this, about the industrialization of the South. There was a semi-proletarianization and they were hired out. And hired out slaves played important roles in the revolts. They don't just go to the Union Army out of happenstance. These are among the same people who built the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't built by nice white folks putting up secret quilts. It didn't happen that way. These were African Americans who organized this. But again, often you don't look to African Americans as theorists and strategists of their own struggle. So what's the importance here? Du Bois is arguing that there was a transformation in slave religion. It became more emancipatory, and it motivated the general strike. Translation, you had a cultural revolution among black folk that stimulated a political revolution that transformed the Civil War into the Confederates were right. What Lincoln was proposing was not consistent with the Constitution. Once he said his objective was to overthrow slavery. Now, how did he come to that conclusion? It was the people on their feet, the slaves on their feet, moving to the Union Army, gave him the realization that in order to win the war, you would have to overthrow slavery. This was the action of African Americans, the concerted, I would argue, strategic action that led to the change in Lincoln's war aims, and even just straight-laced conservative scholars of the Civil War make the point. That's what made the Civil War revolution, to overthrow chattel slavery. That was the motivation from a cultural revolution inside the black community, motivated the political revolution of the general strike, and then motivated the political revolution, which was the revolution of the U.S. Civil War. It didn't create a cultural revolution in America, though. So the recesses, white supremacism just went to the recesses just for a few years, reimposed itself, reinvented itself. So I talk about Locke and others. I want to be aware of time. That's it for me, isn't it? No, I want to respect the time, because I know you all here. I want to be, but think about the debates during the Black Power movement. Which one should come first between the Panthers and US organization, the RNA and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers? And in a larger book project I do that's related to this, I show how each one of them incorporated aspects, missed others, but what they mainly missed and what we continue to miss is the revolution under our feet. What does that model suggest? It also suggests that a cultural revolution, if you want to transform society, there's one that relates outside, one relates inside, and the main one inside is the main cultural contradiction within black communities and within communities throughout the US, and that's sexism. The other part is the cultural revolution that didn't occur. It's hard to have a successful black cultural revolution without a successful white one at the same time. I'm going to stop out of respect for time.
I wasn't using the microphone because I thought it was as loud as you. I'll use the microphone now. Up next is Joshua Price. Joshua Price is a professor of sociology at the State University of New York at Binghamton. He's the author of several books, including Prison and Social Death, Structural Violence, Hidden Brutality in the Lives of Women, and he's also the co-editor of After Prisons, Freedom, Decarceration, and Justice Disinvestment. From 2004 to 2007, he directed the NAACP's Broome County Jail Health Care Project. In 2006, he co-founded the Southern Tier Social Justice Project to advocate for formerly incarcerated people. For his advocacy on behalf of incarcerated people, the Broome/Tioga County NAACP has honored him as the Citizen of the Year, and New York State Assembly has cited him for outstanding commitment to civil rights of New Yorkers. The title of Joshua Price's paper is Jail, Bail, or Marronage.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. I think it was really terrific to hear the previous papers, and I also would like to echo Dr. Henderson in thanking the organizers, Dr. Errol, Dr. Husby. Is it Dr. DeAngelis?
Thomas DeAngelis.
Thomas DeAngelis. Okay, and everybody else. So this has been really terrific. I also would say I teach in the sociology department, but I'll talk about working on issues related to bail. But I wanted to make one quick comment as we sort of make a transition now, I guess, to talking sort of as a kind of closure. And I also teach in a translation program because I'm a translator of Latin American philosophy. And I just taught this seminar called Translating Race and Gender. And one of the questions that we sort of posed was, how do we think about, in the narrow sense, about translating racial and gender terms, and also just as categories of analysis without sort of presupposing the universality of it, of races. And so I sort of wanted to pose that as I was listening to some of the papers today. How do we think about these processes of translation across different realms and so on? Okay. But let me sort of, I think I'd like to speak a bit locally. And I treated this call for papers as a kind of goad to think about something I know very much about. So I'm very excited about the discussion for that as well. And I mean specifically debt and freedom. And so I'm going to talk very much about just upstate New York and where I'm from in Binghamton, just for a few minutes. I better mark my time here. And so, as you may have noticed, people who are based in the States, there's been a lot of discussion lately about bail reform, right? And people being held pending trial. And there's some evidence that there's going to be constitutional challenges, for example, that it's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. That you're only in jail because you're poor, right? So that's one of the sort of interesting things that we could discuss. So I wonder whether, some people have suggested that bail is a kind of like debtor's, prison, although you should say jail, And I don't know if that's accurate, so that's one of the things I thought it would be interesting to discuss. I mean, maybe it is accurate. I'm not saying it's not accurate. I just want to understand it should be understood as debt or not. And then specifically as a way to kind of frame this, what I wanted to ask is, it seems to me in thinking about this, I read this Justice Department's Ferguson report on Ferguson, and freedom there seems to be constructed as freedom from debt. Okay, that seems to be the sort of the underlying understanding of freedom, the presupposition that that's what freedom is. And that seems consistent with a kind of liberal framework for understanding what freedom is. And instead, I wanted to pose this idea of freedom as Marronage, and see where that gets us in thinking about bail. So a different concept of freedom. And specifically, I'm drawing on Neil Roberts' recent book on freedom as Marronage. And you know, he has this, he draws on C.L.R. James and Cedric Robertson and others to try to think about different kinds of marronage, right? The marronage, right, is this is, let's say, approximately kind of escaping from slavery, right, running off, okay, Cimarrones or, you know, Cimarron communities, for example. And I wanted to think about the sociality in solitary confinement in jails as somewhere between what he calls petite marronage, that is to say, individuals running off from slavery, and grand marronage. So you think of quilombos in Brazil, for example, sort of like maroon communities. And instead, I want to think about these sort of realms of sociality at the margins in jails and prisons. And the image that came to mind that I thought might be useful for us in thinking about this liminal realm of marronage within solitary confinement. I thought of the roda in capoeira. If you can kind of if you have an image of capoeira, and that within the roda, within the circle, there's this practice of freedom, even though it sort of masquerades as a combat, masquerading as a dance, you know. But within that, there's this practice of freedom with a kind of like an evocation of Luanda and Angola, like in a lot of the singing, and then of course in the instrumentation as well. So maybe that was one of the sort of images that was helpful to me. I guess I should say this isn't really relevant exactly, except I thought it would. I was also trying to reflect on this. This is from Diego Rivera's Frozen Assets. So this is also, as I was trying to figure out how to think about all these things. This image is from it's at the MoMA. You know, and maybe you can make of it what you will. It's, you know, New York City landscape and stuff like that. Okay, so but this notion, I think, of freedom as marronage puts this idea of freedom within the black radical tradition, as Cedric Robinson frames it. And this wasn't a plan with you to set this up this way, but I wanted to sort of maybe say this in response to what you're saying. You know, but I planned it that way. Okay, so. And then I also thought that there's this sort of emerging category of fugitivity that a lot of theorists, or black theorists, are using, and I also wanted to sort of think of it in that realm as well. You can also see this at Toni Morrison's novel, A Mercy, the incipient forms of sociality that are in conflict with modernity/coloniality, as the decolonial movement calls it. Okay, so I'm going to talk just for 5 or 10 minutes about one particular case where I think it embodies this idea of marronage, and then we can discuss it. And in particular, it's a case of a death of someone held at our county jail who was in solitary for he was there being held, you know, pending his trial for 19 months, and he his name was Saladin Barton. And in 2015, I got a phone call from the NAACP, and they said, you know, could you help this family sort of figure out what to do about the death of their brother, this guy. And so I started to kind of look into it. And I should also say that maybe I can put this in a slightly larger framework. About jails, since maybe people don't understand about it. People know the difference between jails and prisons. People use those interchangeably, but traditionally in the United States, we think of jails as somewhere where you go if you're sentenced for under a year, or if you're facing a trial. Like Rikers Island is a jail, and in New York State we say being sent upstate is going to prison, to penitentiary for more than a year. So think of like Attica or Clinton or something, these sort of large penitentiaries. Okay, so I'm talking about a jail. And I should say that there's been a lot of the prison population, oddly enough, has been declining a lot. It was sort of unanticipated around 2010 or so. It started to decline, but the jail population has increased. And now, of course, we don't know, poof, with with justice reform, right? So maybe the prison population is going to start to rise again. But in any case, in upstate New York, there's been about a 20 or 30% rise of these local jails population in the context of prison population going down. The last thing I'll say in terms of the criminology talk is that Reuben Miller has characterized this as carceral devolution. So the penitentiaries are now sort of pawning off some of the punishment to local jails. So there's sort of like prison population going down, jail population going up. You can see that very markedly in New York and in California, okay, and elsewhere as well. Okay, so I want to get into just a little bit about what needs to be said about Saladin Barton. But since natal alienation kept coming up today, I also wanted to tie it a little bit to that as well. Because, are you showing me this 5-minute sign?
No.
Okay.
I'll show it to you.
No, that's fine. I guess it's current, and it was really an honor for me to sort of hear Orlando Patterson speak, because his thoughts influenced me so much. And I wanted to also sort of place this concept of Marronage as a kind of some kind of an antidote or a kind of a counter to this intrinsic process of natal alienation that's endemic and sort of is institutionalized in prisons and jails, that they're factories of natal alienation, okay, in many different senses. And then also that natal alienation, one of the sort of power of it is that it gives us a sense, it gives us a vocabulary to talk about how jails and prisons are an ongoing threat to reproductive justice for women of color. In particular, but for for everybody who's imprisoned, okay. So that's also why I think that one of the kind of power of natal alienation in talking about jails and prisons as an analytic framework. Okay, so and then this is maybe just sort of encompasses. This is text. This is a text I got on January 24th. So this is sort of verbatim. Okay, Josh, this is to me, right, Josh? So this is a woman who lives near me, and her son is at Clinton in penitentiary. So so she has a kind of a very strong sense of irony here about how it works as a kind of natal alienation, right? So that the institutions of the state are there to grab my kid out of my possession if if they perceive me as a menace to the kid, but. Then they're going to come in, and even if he's a minor in an adult prison, and they're going to beat the hell out of him, right? And no one does anything for that, right? So that seems to me kind of encompasses the sense of natal alienation, or is an example of it, or however you want to put it. Okay, so back to Saladin Barton. So he was there for 19 months. He kept getting into trouble. He's schizophrenic. They kept holding back his medication, and then. What I did as part of my initial work is, this idea of a Freedom of Information Act. I requested this death report that's generated by the state every time someone dies in custody, and one of the things I'm sorry I missed Dr. Hartman yesterday, is because her work is also kind of really amazing, and she has this thing about not putting black suffering on display. Okay, so I don't intend to reproduce that. But in this case, we're saved from that possibility, because his death report, this is a facsimile of it, was sent to me of all the conditions that surrounded his death. Okay, so I won't have the opportunity to put his suffering on display. So this is the official account of his death, as generated by the state of New York. Okay, but on the other hand, and this is one of the things that I thought was sort of interesting about this point of view of Marronage, is that all these people in solitary. Now, I think people sometimes on the outside have a false idea of solitary as the silent place where everyone's just completely alone, which is not exactly correct. First of all, it's just extremely loud. By everyone I've ever talked to who's on solitary, it's just crazily loud, right? And people fulminating all day long and all night long. But then the other thing is that there's an enormous amount of sociality, And Saladin Barton died after spending months and months in jail. And then tons of people just started writing to the NAACP, to his lawyer, and to other people outside about what happened to him when he died. Okay, and I wanted to find both the act of writing these letters, but also what they reveal about how the people kind of like were helping each other out on solitary, and without romanticizing it, God knows. But at least to give some kind of evidence for that as a kind of counter narrative. Okay, so both according to his family and according to a lot of the people who were with him, when he kept getting beaten when he was there, he started having all these seizures. Okay. And then they would kind of like, torment him, and then have you 5 minutes? Okay, all right, okay. And here's another letter. I don't know if should I read it over, or should I just like show it to you? So this is one of another letter. This is an account of his death. He told me he was dizzy and blizzing into his head, right? So they're yelling to each other from one cell to the next cell. The very next day, he said he feels dizzy. I told him to lay down, and that's when I heard the thump, and I began to call his name loudly, and he would not respond. All right. This is, and then going backwards a little bit in time, people started writing to outsiders even while he was still alive, okay? And they were sort of like saying, we got to do something for this guy, right? So they were feeling a sense of urgency about it. I've seen multiple correctional officers abuse him physically and verbally. They don't give him all of his food sometimes. He lost 60 pounds when he was in solitary. I know that because the family released all of his medical records to me to sort of look them over, right? And the nurses were also noticing that he was losing tons of weight. And this is one of the reasons it's attributed, because they were starving him. Okay, so these are all from letters. This is after his death. All right. And this is part of what's interesting to me is, this concept of social death from Orlando Patterson. It has it's a kind of three aspects to it, right? It's systemic and systematized violence, humiliation, or kind of institutionalized dishonoring of someone, and natal alienation. It's that kind of triumvirate of violence, humiliation, and natal alienation that for Patterson are the constituent elements of slavery, right? And here, I was sort of interested in how it kind of like extends after his death, right? So they're still kind of mocking him. Even after the guy's dead, they're like making these, these jokes or whatever that are enraging to people. And then I thought I would just sort of end with some of his words, and then we can kind of figure out what to say about this. This is the last letter. These last two things are notes. They're called medical slips. Like they're slips saying I need to see a doctor, basically, right? Are we out of time?
No.
Oh, okay. All right.
I'm looking intently.
Oh, okay. I was trying to interpret your expression. Right. So this is the medical slip saying I really need to see a doctor. Okay. I find it, of course, it's retroactively has this poignancy, right? Because of the because of what we know happened to him. I don't know if you ever saw that film Fruitvale Station. You remember that film? Yeah, exactly. And then all these like text messages have these kind of poignancy about it because of what afterwards. It takes on this sort of added quality to it. But it seems captured very well. And then now from a certain perspective, Saladin's death was unexceptional. It's a mere blip, a brief item in a police blotter. And he's only one of several thousand people who die each year at the hands of police. I guess 1,000 about every year at the hands of police, and then tons of people die in custody. One of tens of thousands over the past several decades, and you can do the math. Each death is extraordinary, however, and each death is worth mourning separately and in its own way. So even while Mr. Barton's case drew exceptional sympathy from many people with whom he was incarcerated, I wanted to zero on his life, not because it was exceptional, but quite the contrary. So his tragic, avoidable fate at a county jail encapsulates some of the deep challenges we confront, as including the over-reliance on solitary confinement inadequate counsel, and then in particular, for our purposes, the bail system that condemned him to spend something like 19 months in jail without a trial, inadequate health care while he was incarcerated. So I wanted to sort of think about that and think about this question of debt and freedom, and then the specific versions of freedom, freedom from debt versus freedom as Marronage, as ways we could try to figure out, how to understand the sociality. Now, there's something that I'll sort of leave you with a couple last ideas. As I was trying to understand this, as I said, this idea of social death really influenced me a lot. But then I just read Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. I'm not really a Hannah Arendt scholar, but she has this idea of natality, and natality for her is the human capacity for political acts that are unexpected. And that's why she thinks that natality is a really central category of the political for her. And so I was sort of interested, sort of contraposing to natal alienation, this idea, Hannah Arendt's idea of natality, and this kind of unexpected sociality that sort of blossomed, in the kind of the stonework of solitary confinement. Then I also, Angela Davis and David Graeber both think that part of the modern penitentiary and the sort of dehumanization intrinsic to it is the kind of the imposition of what Ian Hacking calls the avalanche of numbers. In other words, the quantification of life in all different kinds of respects, right? And so, Angela Davis has this whole thing about how punishment as a sentence of time is part of the preconditions of capitalism, allow you to think of prison sentences is like a time, that's going to be the punishment, and so thinking about that kind of quantification, contraposing it to this idea of natality, I wanted to sort of see where that leaves us, and then the last thing I'd say is that this is there's something kind of haunting, right, about this. And maybe there's been a bit written in the last few years about this idea of trying to remember haunting as kind of an important category of human experience, right? When we're thinking about how we make our plans for the future and this kind of creativity that all of us embody, this possibility for unexpected creativity. So I want to hang on to that and think with you about that. And maybe on that, I think I'd like to leave us and try to figure out, one thing I'm particularly interested in, is how does that help us think about how to fight for, changed bail conditions. But that's just my concern. I'm sure you guys have lots of other kinds of concerns, including concerns that aren't sort of directly applicable that way, which is, of course, I'm also interested in, kind of conceptual ones. So let me leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Exposes how the Haitian Revolution sort of challenges our understanding of freedom and understanding of who's deserving of freedom and who can embody freedom. Again, Errol's work on highlighting the potential of the Black American Cultural Revolution and the general strike is especially important in our current times. And Joshua's work, I'm really interested in the methodology that she kind of took about, taking this sort of social scientific approach to understanding Neil Roberts' book, which is a heavily political philosophy and almost comparative literature type work. So again, thank you all for your perspectives on the work. We can open the floor for questions. So, Jesse, you have your hand up.
Thank you for your presentations. They were marvelous. I have a comment and a question for Joshua, Christ. Sorry.
Josh is great. Joshua.
Sorry, I'm kind of a bit flustered from the presentation. So the comment is, I guess for everybody, on June 30th, the New York State Assembly is actually going to be voting on a law called Calixte's Law, which is going to help facilitate getting pretrial detainees out of jail from detention centers in New York quicker than before because of they want to change things with speedy trial, guarantees, bail reform, and specifically focusing on keeping youth out of solitary confinement. So that's the first thing, call your representative squadron, get them to push that through. And then the question is, when you were using the word haunting to describe, I guess, some of these phenomena, I wonder if that's, I'm trying to figure out how to word this, like, does the framing of it in this kind of like haunting, because like the other words that come to mind are like ghost, like I'm just immediately thinking of death, and does that almost kind of, like it felt like counterintuitive to me to like describe it as haunting, because I feel like it almost removes like a very human, real, material, physical quality of the Black suffering and being that kind of makes me feel, I guess, just like startled. So I was wondering if you could just expand on your use of the word haunting to describe this.
Okay, sure. I mean, I can spend a little, and then I'm interested in what other people think. And I have no particular attachment either to the concept or just to the, however you want to think about it. So if it's not useful, you know. I'll just say a couple of things. So let me start with my town. So there's like a long memory in my town, especially among African Americans, for people who died at the jail. So start to talk about Saladin Barton. People remember people. What's her name? I can't remember right now. There's a woman who supposedly hung herself with her bra about a half an hour after she got to the jail in the 1980s. You know, and then everyone would say, well, you know, she didn't wear a bra. You know, she had 5 kids. She gets put there in half an hour, and this is like in the 80s, right? And so at the first, I just meant like it seemed important to figure out how to describe how that like this long like community memory of people who died at the jail about just bad things that happened at the jail is kept alive. So haunting is like maybe a problematic placeholder for trying to acknowledge that. And then as I was trying to think through the parallel to capoeira, which also may be an unuseful analogy or whatever, that as I said, that when people get together to do capoeira, like a lot of the singing has to do with invoking the slave ships and Angola and Luanda, and so that struck me as like, and that also may not be haunting exactly, like to call it that, like I don't, but just was, yeah, and then maybe as I said, there are ways that sociologists think about how memories sort of inhabit the present in ways that are useful, and you can also see in literature, like Toni Morrison, of course, as well, like obviously. So that's how, but I don't know if that's like really speaks to your concerns or why you found it kind of startling or
I have 2 specific questions for Dr. Henderson. Wake up, wake up. Okay.
Woke alone.
Okay. The first question deals with the relationship between debt, slavery, and the concept of intellectual reparation. For instance, I'm a sociologist. I have taught for sociological theory and political theory. So, for instance, I learned about the work of Talcott Parsons who published the Negro American. But before Parsons, in 1915, Du Bois, he is also Haitian because his father was born in Haiti, okay? He published the Negro, then he published Black Folk, then and now, and he said in the history and sociology of the Negro race. Then he published The Soul of Black Folk, the Philadelphia Negro, the Negro Problem. So Du Bois was the great scholar on race, on Negro, but they undermined his work because of racism. Now, when we are discussing about the debt of slavery, the cost of freedom, debt and slavery, to what extent, according to your standpoint, what is your thinking about intellectual reparation? Intellectual reparation. This is the first question. And the second one, the last one, deal with the Haitian Revolution. In 1779, the fighter for freedom, in French we say les chasseurs volontaires de Saint-Domingue, the chasseurs for freedom, the fighter for freedom, they came in Savannah, Georgia, and in the final battle of Savannah, the U.S. had his independence because of the Battle of Savannah. But even though the Haitian people, because the idea of a state nation, we cannot have at all a state nation without the concept of self-sacrifice. The Haitian people at that time, it was not Haiti, it was Saint-Domingue. They fought for the American independence. But after the independence, the U.S., because of racism, they saw in the Haitian Revolution like a challenge for the southern state. They didn't recognize the Haitian Revolution. It took until 1862, okay, and Abraham Lincoln we recognized Haiti as a free, a sovereign state. So now when we are thinking about Haiti, what do you think as a professor of political theory and political science when we look through the work of Amy Goodman, Charles Taylor, the politics of recognition? So what do you think about the recognition and the reparation that the Haitian people deserve from the U.S. that who, according to my understanding, the United States as a country has like an intellectual and moral debt towards Haiti and the Haitian people?
Appreciate what you asked, to the extent I can ask. I'm not a historian, or I'm a scholar of international relations. I focus on culture and war. So I'm gonna do my best to answer. To your first, to answer in opposite order, Haiti has a right to reparations. The other parts relate to the endurance of white supremacism. White supremacism will manifest itself in different ways, but it persists as white supremacism. And part of what power does, and what Du Bois recognized, is that power doesn't concede to truth. It simply makes new truth. And this leads to your next point. The intellectual subordination, especially of black theorists, is such that there's an old saying, and I'm from a housing project called Brewster Projects in Detroit, Michigan. It said, people who won't treat you right won't teach you right. So to understand liberation, you're probably not going to get it from folks who are not involved in your liberation struggle and who won't teach you about your successes. So Malcolm, for example, and others evoke the Haitian Revolution. They don't invoke, though, the slave revolution right under their feet. Du Bois sets it up in Black Reconstruction, what I didn't talk about because I was concerned for time, but he didn't theorize it. He historicized it. He said it happened in history, but he provided no theory. You know who did? Alain Locke, the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, who gave us much of cultural relativism. You know, at his speeches at Howard University in 1916, he gave them at the Y in 1915. He constructed this notion that race was not biological, it was not anthropological, he said it was sociological. He said it was a social construct. That's 1916. I don't need no book about Army and Whiting about racial formation 70 years later to teach me that. But why don't we learn Locke as race as a social construct? The same reason we don't learn Lucy Parsons' type of feminism. When she's telling the tramps in the 1890s, learn the use of explosives. That's anarchism, flip feminism for Lucy Parsons. Or Ida B. Wells is one of the foundational scholars of sociology for her systematic analysis of lynching in Southern horrors in 1892. So part of what strikes me, and this is what strikes me and why some of the pieces resonate with me, we should know Bwai Kaiman. Because at Bwai Kaiman in Haiti, the culture, they drew from that culture, created a cultural revolution to make a political revolution. The same process that happened in the United States. The same debate that went on in the 1960s. But we have black scholarship, like from Harold Cruz in 1967. No conferences commemorating the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. People won't study Harold Cruz because he said something bad about Michael Gold, or he said Lorraine Hansberry's folks were slumlords in Chicago just because they were. But they won't study him. Meanwhile, they'll quote from Althazar. He killed his wife and got away with it. But they still quote him. They still cite him. You said you won't study W.E.B. Du Bois or Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was a sellout. I'd like to see you in 1895 in Tuskegee, Alabama, black, and what union you gonna join. You know what I'm saying? But this is the silliness of black intellectualism under conditions of white supremacism. That is, it will teach you only enough so you won't theorize independently. Then we get to these institutions and act like we're in coal mines. It's like when he's talking about going to jail. We've been organizing prisons since before I got to college. We shut down the University of Michigan as a student. We shut down Wayne State University, held it for 11 days to create an Africana study as a student. People say, well, you talk like that, Dr. Henderson, because you're tenure. I talk like this because I talk like this. You see what I'm saying? If you won't struggle now when it's about your grade, you think you won't struggle when it's about your job. So we got to teach liberation. Stop trying to pretend that this is hard. It's different, but it's not difficult. So when you ask me that question, I'm gonna close it now because I know I'll start talking. When you ask me that about the intellectualism, I tried to hit from what we do for students and professionally, and who do we cite? Whose work do we cite in our syllabus? Who do we put on our overhead? You come in my international relations class, 300 people, predominantly white. White supremacism is on the overhead. It's going to be on the test. Bell hooks is on the overhead. It's going to be on the test. I don't wait till the black folks show up. And if you look on my Facebook page, next to it, it says, this is white racism at Penn State. And it has the provost, my boss's 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 boss. This is Nick Jones and white supremacism. So a lot of folks can't hear what we're saying for seeing what we're doing. So you want to challenge this, overturn white supremacism. And let me say this, in case I was equivocating. On each area, from LGBTQA rights to poor folks to women's issues or feminism or patriarchy, you give me the category at the bottom in this country. For every category, going to be the one called black. For each one of those. So what happens when you overturn white supremacism, you overturn a major mode of domination, and don't get sidetracked by it. But you know, there are other things I know. I want to focus on this one. This is the one I want to focus on, because the more I focus on it, somebody else want to say, you know, there are other things. No, I didn't have a clue. So White Cayman, the pattern has been a cultural revolution. And why do you need it? Gramsci said it, but I didn't need Gramsci. Du Bois said it, and he wasn't in one of Mussolini's prisons at the same time. I'm not knocking him. I'm saying, how is this relevant to me? More relevant than Du Bois. Du Bois said it. You must have a cultural revolution because the people have been denied that they even have a culture. That's why you can't just do what they've done in Africa. You get rid of the French. I know. I'm Chokwe. I'm Yoruba. I'm Wolof. I knew that before they got here. You get rid of white supremacism here for black Americans, especially in the 19th century. There's a debate whether we even have a culture. So the cultural revolution comes first and it guides it. I'm not saying it has to. I'm saying there's a revolution, and Locke theorized it. He said you must pose a cultural claim that implicates political and economic democracy. That's what he theorized. I didn't get to it. It's in the paper. And there's one thing and only one thing that does that after chattel slavery. It's reparations. Reparations for Jim Crow, and there's only one Jim Crow. It ain't a new one. White supremacism just reasserted itself. We defeated the first one. If you just think there's a new one, you'll think you won't learn from the victories. So I say learn from the victories, and to give reparations, to recognize the right of reparations for Haiti, you have to acknowledge the crimes committed against Haiti. And that's one of the reasons they don't. And my last point, if you want to get these police, those police, there's no statute of limitation for murder. This is police murder. We should organize against them just like we went and got the murderers of the 16th Street Church. But what does that suggest when you start doing that? You want to get police murders just like we got the old murders from the 16th Street Church, the killing of the 4 little girls in Birmingham, Alabama. Right? Same way we did that, even if it takes decades later, because there's no statute of limitations for murder. What's the objective? Toward what end? Make repair for the injustice. But when you start talking like that for police murder, it raised the issue of reparations. And the question, don't put a question to me as a black man, what does reparations mean to you? What does reparations mean to you as a white person? So that's humbling, and I think I'm awake though.
Means I need a spreadsheet.
Yeah, I have a response to one part of the main thing that you said in that, but I'm just thinking, again, I just stress the importance of a cultural revolution in setting a political revolution. And you mentioned in your talk where Malcolm X talked about a cultural revolution, but sort of ignores the one that was at his feet, right?
Yes.
I would say, I mean, I would think, right, or I actually want to know what you would think about, or how you would understand the Nation of Islam as part of this cultural revolution beforehand. I know, like, chronologically, it skips around a little bit, like that precedes, you know, the point of time that you're talking about him when he was working, you know, in the Organization of African American Unity, and a little bit like towards the end of his tenure with the nation, you know. But the type of Black Islam or Black, you know, Black Muslimness that Malcolm X pushed and promoted, again, I feel like he theorized that as a cultural revolution in some capacity. So I want to know what you would think about that. And I know, like, a lot of that, right? You mentioned his thinking as referencing revolution going on the African continent at the time, right? And I feel like that's essential, like a big part of his thinking, right? So I don't know if that can be reconciled with, you know, your suggestion about how it's necessary that he looks at something going on in, you know, in the Americas or in the United States. So.
I'll be quick. If Malcolm had lived to see Watts, Malcolm's killed before the Watts revolt in '65. I think if he lived to see Watts, he would have turned his focus from Africa in a different way. You read Malcolm's diary, and I have, when he's traveling to Africa. Malcolm's no sucker. He's seeing how the game is being played in Africa as well. So the other is Malcolm didn't live long enough. He was 39 until 5 members of the Nation of Islam killed him. The Nation of Islam was never a revolutionary organization. So they didn't have a thesis on cultural revolution. Matter of fact, the Nation of Islam was actually, the theology, as you read Message to the Black Man, is actually even anti-black. You know, Farad Muhammad said, black folks' hair was like our mustache, nice and straight, till we descended into the jungles of Africa. You know, Malcolm says that. The Nation of Islam is not even but Malcolm becomes a Sunni Muslim. But what's clear is Malcolm's a black nationalist. He never stops being a black nationalist. Marable gets it wrong. Marable says he becomes an internationalist, which I argue is ideologically meaningless. All major theory has an international component. Which one doesn't? They often say that to deny what black nationalism is, but black nationalism, especially if it's progressive and revolutionary form. But to the point, Malcolm says 3 days before he's killed, he says, if you want to see the black nationalists, come down to the Audubon Ballroom this weekend. He's talking about where he's killed. So when Marable says he's reticent about saying it, he said it on a radio show in New York City. That's not where you go to be shy and reticent, you know? So Malcolm didn't theorize the cultural revolution, but the two were there. And what's ironic is, as in the larger project, you can see the ones who come closer, as the Panther Party, us, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, the Congress of African People, even the PLA, the ones that come closest, ironically, is the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and they're a Marxist organization. But they dissemble because of the debate that Du Bois had actually reconciled before. And this is the beauty of just looking at, when you look at black theory, you see that the theorists anticipated many of these issues that would later confound folks. And it's evident today as well in Black Lives Matter, unfortunately. What's the role of culture and media, especially in your revolution? This is what Cruz is talking about in '67. He's not the only one. That's not the argument I'm making. But that particular one he's making is critical because we still find ourselves in a similar situation now. And he said this before, there was from hip hop or social media. So that's what. So I hope I answered your question. Malcolm didn't live long. He was only 39, just like King, and he didn't live long enough. And that's why it's a challenge to build on that theory. This is what I challenge scholars, especially, should be doing. I'm not knocking the other. It just seemed to be more than enough of that, and we're not building on what's actually revolutionary theory from right under our feet. That's what I write.
I wonder if all of you could follow up on that idea. What is the role of culture in kind of changing the way we see freedom, right, and the way we see revolution? I mean, you're talking about Dr. Calixte, you're talking about misunderstandings, right, of how we see freedom, and you know, in the Haitian Revolution, as Professor Henderson is pointing out, like, my understanding is that the syncretism of African religions with the new context of the New World really did pushed like the power and empowered the slaves to revolt. And Professor Price, you also talked about kind of the role of translation in understanding what it means something, right? What freedom will mean and what depth would mean and all of that. So I wonder if you guys can talk a little bit about how do you see incorporating the culture of others, those others that are being oppressed, into the new ways of thinking about freedom.
Ok, alors, Calixte, la question qu'elle vous a posée, c'est que dans votre présentation, vous avez mentionné la non-compréhension, le malentendu entre les Haïtiens, les Américains les Haïtiens sur la notion de la liberté. Sa question spécifique, c'est d'après vous, quel est le rôle de la culture dans ce malentendu? Voilà. You can speak and I will try. Oh, vous pouvez parler, je vais essayer de faire la translation.
Again, excuse my English, I will speak French.
Okay.
En fait, le concept, le mot liberté est un mot à malentendu.
Okay, the concept of liberty, freedom, has some misunderstanding.
Depuis les Grecs,
since the Greek, the classics,
les Grecs jusqu'aux modernes. Les modernes,
since the Greek to the modern.
Les modernes, c'est la période qui va de la fin du Moyen Âge.
Okay, the modern, by modern or modernity, from the middle age,
vers la Révolution française.
Until the French Revolution, 1789.
Et aujourd'hui encore, la liberté pose des problèmes de malentendu.
Nowadays, the concept of liberty, freedom is so complex and problematic.
En fait, on a l'impression que les cultures, l'idée de la liberté ajoutée aux cultures mène vers des malentendus.
Okay, we have the feeling that the concept of freedom mixed to the cultural diversity lead us to some misunderstanding.
Et, en fait, là je vais reprendre une thèse développée par Tocqueville.
Okay, I will follow Alexis de Tocqueville.
Dans un livre qu'il a publié, c'est peut-être le plus beau livre, mais méconnu.
In one of his publications, one of the most important, maybe one of the unknown books.
L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution.
L'Ancien Régime, the former regime and the Revolution.
En fait, Tocqueville dit la thèse qu'il soutient dans ce livre, c'est que on marchait vers la Révolution. Les révolutionnaires n'ont rien fait.
Selon la Révolution française, parlant de la Révolution française.
Oui, en parlant de la Révolution française. Okay. Mais en fait, c'est une idée qu'on peut reprendre sur beaucoup d'autres révolutions. C'est que les sociétés marchent vers le changement. En fait, c'est un peu ça son idée.
According to Alexis de Tocqueville, society is not static. All the society are working towards revolution, towards transformation.
Donc, du coup, il y a en germe l'idée de malentendu, parce qu'il y en a qui vont rester sur l'ancienne idée et d'autres qui vont vers la demande de nouveaux lois.
Okay, so some people will stay according to the status quo, and others will adopt a behavior for having a change, a social transformation.
Donc voilà en germe l'idée de malentendu. On a toujours l'idée de malentendu dans les sociétés autour de la question de la liberté.
In any kind of society, we have the idea, the concept of misunderstanding.
En fait, c'est parce que la culture elle-même, elle est dynamique.
Okay, because culture is not static. Culture is dynamic.
Donc en France actuellement, vous voyez tous les malentendus autour de la question de la liberté.
Now we have the current example of France about the idea of culture, you know, with Mélenchon, Le Pen and so forth. Yeah.
Par exemple, le mariage pour tous, par exemple.
The same-sex marriage, gay, lesbian marriage.
C'est une question de malentendu autour de la liberté.
It's a misunderstanding about what liberty means.
Parce que la loi a été votée et elle est contestée encore maintenant.
Because they promulgate a law, but some people did not accept that law.
Donc, le mot pour dire que la culture, le mot pour dire que les malentendus sont au sein des sociétés, c'est les Grecs qui l'ont inventé, c'est le mot crise.
Okay, the concept crisis is very useful to understand the misunderstanding on liberty or freedom.
Donc aujourd'hui encore, on a des crises, on a des malentendus autour de la liberté. Et avant, entre la révolution française, la révolution haïtienne et la révolution américaine, il y a cet énorme malentendu parce qu'en Haïti, on pensait que la liberté était pour tout le monde.
Because in Haiti, since in 1804, when the Haitian Revolution, the Haitian people, our ancestors, they thought that freedom was for everybody.
Alors que la révolution américaine pensait la liberté pour des ascendants européens.
Why the American people, they thought about liberty according to the lens, white lens, European lens.
Donc les deux n'ont pas la même vision du mot liberté.
So each one has not the same vision on liberty or freedom.
Donc c'est là aussi un problème de culture.
It's also a problem of a cultural problem. But okay, it's good.
I guess I would only say this. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to respond to that really great question. I maybe just to return to something I said initially, which is that let me put it this way. The reason I just came from Barbados, so there was this conference on creolized languages, and it was really interesting to see people from different parts of the Caribbean communicating and trying to communicate about Creole and how it works with different Anglophone, Francophone, and Hispanophone, Spanish-speaking, to say the three biggies. And one of the things I guess I was sort of proposing at the beginning, and this also sort of take up what you're saying, is that, you know, we have this challenge here, if instead of presupposing kind of universals, to try to think about how can we think about translation as a way of taking incommensurate or seemingly incommensurate contexts and trying to figure out how to communicate them and make connections, intellectual connections, but also maybe for the purposes of, you were talking about a kind of cultural revolution, right? And to give an example very briefly, I think I'm going to get his name wrong, but there's this book I just read by, I think his name, Brent Hayes Edwards. Does anyone know?
Yeah.
Ben Edwards. Yeah, and it's on Black diaspora, and he's interested in how specific. He takes this idea from Leopold Senghor of, did you say décalé?
Ouais.
Is that what décalé?
Oui.
That he says that translation can be a kind of décalé, where he says it's like if you put something into like a table, you know, when you're at a cafe and it's not really, you know, and you put something in to keep it all level. Calé. And so then the décalé is to take that away, so then you've noticed that it's not stable again. And he wants to see, he takes Senghor, this guy Edwards, takes Senghor with this concept of décalé and sees translation as décalé. So you can kind of make connections across difference, but you can also have a sense of how unstable and fragile those are, right? But that you're still kind of making the connection. And I maybe propose that back to you or to all of us, because there's such very different context in which each of us are theorizing. To take this idea of décalé as ways of making that connection, understanding the fragility of the gesture towards some kind of like, kind of cultural revolution, but attentive to those differences among us.
I'm talking about overthrowing the system. Overthrowing the cultural system of white supremacy and replacing it with a different, okay? I want to be clear about that. So I'm going to use it in a metaphorical sense. So when I say the Civil War was a political, or some people make military separate, I don't, a political revolution. Okay? So I mean, that's a revolution. The Cultural Revolution from, as Mao has espoused it, Lenin rejected it at first and then accepted it. But they looked at it as pre-revolutionary, a requisite, or as post-revolutionary. What Gramsci made the point that it's not likely to occur in places with advanced civil societies, like this one. See? So you have to theorize what is it peculiar about this. That's what Cruz attempted to do in '67, but he didn't draw on these antecedents either. Cruz didn't. So you ask yourself, the cultural system you're trying to overthrow, what Cruz was arguing is that because there was an ongoing civil rights movement, he said, how do you revolutionize it? Well, you have to revolutionize it through expanding and challenging not only the political system, the legal system, but the economic one. He said you can't do that straightforward. You have to challenge it at its weakest point, which was the cultural front, where blacks were already represented, where they could already make cultural claims. The legal revolutionary black workers will argue you do it at the point of production. But they were in the auto industries in Detroit and in Highland Park, see? So that, but they weren't talking about a cultural revolution at the beginning. But the result was, and it came from the impetus of people like Marion Kramer, who was a founding member of the League, who started arguing about how we had to organize in the plants and outside of the plants simultaneously. This was so similar to what was going on, the processes of the slave revolts and the general strike, but they didn't see the continuity in them. So that's why it's important to see the continuity so you can see what your cultural frame. And you separate the draw on this, but not to stay separate, just to attend to the peculiarity of it. And that's why it can ultimately be cosmopolitan. But what happens is often folks will deny that, and especially when it's black, and even more so when it's black women. The struggle, the urban peace and justice movement started in this country in the mid-1980s with mothers like Clementine Barfield, mothers of children who've been murdered in Detroit, Brenda Muhammad in Atlanta, Mothers Rock in LA. They organized the truces. See, this is 86, 87, the most progressive period in hip hop, the Reagan Revolution. This is, but historians haven't gotten to it yet. So folks try to relate today's struggle to a half century ago. We didn't have widespread use of computers, much less social media, instead of relating it to that period and the lessons drawn and the mistakes from that. But this is what I call the ignored culture revolution. It wasn't a revolution now, but they were attempting to, but it's mainly ignored because it was mostly led by black women. See? And then, so the cultural revolution for folks, for example, if we talk about Latinos, the or a cultural revolution, the salience of it would have to be different, even only for linguistic reasons. That is, and here I'm talking about linguistic legitimacy. While black folks trying to argue whether there's such a thing as Ebonics, and I don't think there is, but if there's such a thing as Ebonics, there's a linguistic legitimacy for Latinos to make entree in the cultural, that blacks don't. It doesn't make it good, or it's just different. See? But you lose this because there's this huge liberal paradigm that says we all got to be together and to do, or this progressive Marxism that says we all lose our identity under this notion of just this one, this international proletariat. It's like, no, we've been through this. It's why people know Emma Goldman and don't know Callie House, who organized the Ex-Slave Bounty and Pension Association. 300,000 black ex-slaves, you know what they wanted? Their pensions. 300,000, Callie House was the leader. You don't know her. Emma Goldman knew her. She did her wash in prison. You say? So it's like Mary Frances Berry, My Face is Black is True. You can read about Callie House. So this particular black woman and those struggles, to look at the peculiarities so you can actually have something that is in fact revolution. So for people who've been denied their culture, culture revolution seems to be, look, notice my language, important. I didn't say it's a necessity. I'm not a millenarian. I'm not waiting on a revolution like Jesus or something. It seems to be appropriate where it's denied. And the main cultural claim of reparations is essential. Alain Locke said cultures are dynamic, just like brother said. We change from, he called it transvaluation within and tolerance and reciprocity between. He says but he wedded his notion of culture with democracy. And he said the hardest one to achieve, none had achieved multiracial democracy, the hard one was the cultural democracy because it had to implicate both economic and political democracy. And you see, there's little concession. What concessions has white supremacy made, even in the economic realm? There's the political realm is marginal. The economic realm is a joke. You know how to alleviate black poverty today. The difference between, even the Russians gave land to their serfs, but black slaves were not given any rights in land. That's the difference between black and white income levels today. There's no mystery to it. Just like there's no mystery how you end poverty abroad, you know? The manumission of women, removing women, as Christopher Hitchens used to say, from the animal cycle of reproduction, recognizing women's rights, their reproductive rights, and redistribution of land. There's no mystery to how to do it. So I'm not sitting up here talking about some new mystification of white supremacism and patriarchy, or getting a new word for it, and a scholarship, and hopefully I get a grant to study it. You know what I'm saying? So this part of my challenge. So I don't say cultural revolution is inevitable, any of that sort. It seemed to be historically consistent with Black America because, again, these were the debates revisited in the Black Power movement, and they became kind of bloody. And the last point is, I think it's unfortunate that you have some members of who are thoroughly in need of a social theory in Black Lives Matter, which I support, who are saying ridiculous things like it's not your grandfather's civil rights movement in a pejorative sense. Yeah, first you wish it was. And if you really knew it, you wish it was. And second, yeah, you about to be. Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
We're going to have to end, but I don't want to have the last word. I want to hear what Thomas has heard.
Okay. Yeah.
I want to listen a little bit more.
Again, well, thank you everyone for being here. I mean, I feel like some of my thoughts that I've had about, I mean, I'm super excited about this, you know, being the last panel of the weekend. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't hear me. I don't talk this loud as you, like I think I do. Yeah, so I'm super excited that this is the last panel of the weekend. And that's what everyone has been saying, things we've been talking about, thinking about. Some of the big thoughts that I've had personally on, again, after today, right, and yesterday, is thinking about, like, central to the conference, which has been the question of Blackness, and specifically the question of Black freedom, and thinking about how Black freedom itself, Black freedom troubles freedom itself, or what we understand to be as freedom. And also thinking about some of the ways that we've been trying to think through that, you know, whether it has been through what's being called Afro-pessimism, or what Cynthia Harmon was talking about, waywardness, or what Joshua was talking about, Marronage. And so I think it's been really exciting to hear these new ways of thinking about. So I hope when we leave, you know, the thing that we continue to think about is, again, the problematic of Black freedom and these ways that we can think through it, these solutions, or these other ways that we can keep challenging through this. And I think that's it. I'm supposed to wrap it up. So thank you everyone for attending the conference this weekend. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you.